Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue, and I'm very grateful to all participants for joining us on such short notice for this very important and timely event. This past Monday, in a move that took many by surprise, the Peruvian Congress voted overwhelmingly 105 to 19 votes in the 130-member body to impeach President Martin Vizcarra based on accusations of corruption. Vizcarra became president in March 2018 when his predecessor, with whom he served as vice president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, was forced to resign also amidst corruption charges. Vizcarra is scheduled to leave office in July of next year after elections take place on April 11th. Vizcarra's abrupt ouster plunged Peru into a political crisis and has sparked street protests, which spread and intensified yesterday. There were reportedly over 15,000 protesters in Plaza San Martin in Lima, claiming that a corrupt Congress had engineered a coup without any legal basis. The head of the Congress, Manuel Merino, assumed the presidency on Tuesday. The troubling series of events have heightened concerns about the country's political stability and its economy, which is already projected to shrink 14% in 2020, more than any other Latin American country besides Venezuela. Peru, with some 70% in the informal sector, has also been particularly devastated by the pandemic. In this context, many questions come to mind. How can we explain and understand the politics behind Vizcarra's abrupt ouster? What were arguments for and against impeachment? Did Vizcarra do the right thing by going along with the vote? Should we expect Merino to be president through July? Will the April election go forward as scheduled? What should we expect from the Merino administration and Congress in coming months in terms of appointments to the Constitutional Tribunal and also economic policies? And what are the economic implications of Peru's unstable politics? How is this chaos being seen outside of the country by markets and investors? 30 years ago, after living in Peru for 3 years, I wrote an essay that started with just one word: precarious. Thankfully, today there is no terrorist threat and no hyperinflation, as was the case back then. But it strikes me that the country's politics, usually a bit shaky, have not been so precarious in a long time. Fortunately, we have 3 outstanding specialists who have agreed to share their insights and perspectives with us this morning before opening it up to all of your questions and comments. All of them are very good friends and close to the dialogue. First, we'll hear from Gino Costa, who joins us from Lima, and he participated in yesterday's protests with a lot of young people. Gino is a member of Congress from the Partido Morado, and who has been a key player in this drama, and the party voted against the vacancy, against the impeachment. He will give us an on-the-ground perspective, tell us what we know, what we should know about his congressional colleagues and the new president, and what we should expect. Thank you so much, Gino. Great to have you with us. Next,
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, we will hear from Cynthia McClintock, a professor of political science, international affairs at George Washington University, who is a leading authority on Peru, has written countless books and articles, and Cynthia tracked developments there as closely as anyone I know. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thanks, Mike.
And finally, we'll hear from Luis Ordóñez, the head of currencies, commodities, and emerging market research at JP Morgan, who joins us today from London. And Luis will discuss Peru's economic outlook in light of the ongoing political crisis, and will tell us how concerned markets and investors are about what is happening in his country. Thank you so much, Luis.
Thanks, Michael.
Just to let participants know, they can submit questions with the Q&A feature in Zoom, on Twitter, using our hashtag #WhatNextForPeru, or by emailing meetings@thedialogue.org. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gino to get us started. Gino?
Thank you, Mike, for the invitation. First, what happened
you've made a good summary of it. On Monday, the president was packing in a vacancy process, a sort of fast-track impeachment that lasted less than 2 weeks. This was the second attempt to send him home in 2 months, and it was the fourth such a vacancy process in the last 4 years. In our whole Republican history, only 3 times have presidents been vacated or impeached through this mechanism. So the last 4 years have seen an intense use of such a mechanism as a consequence of an executive government that has had very little presence in Congress, and great instability and great confrontation between the government and Congress. This vacancy is part of that logic, which has marked the last 4 years. Regarding this first issue, there's a great controversy as to whether this vacancy or this impeachment was constitutional or not. There's a widespread agreement that it's not legitimate because the country has rejected it, and we will see the reactions. But there's great controversy as to the legality of this mechanism. So that's number one. Number two, the reaction. The reaction has been widespread protest in the whole country. Are they surprising? They are surprising in a way, yes. But polls made before this fast-track impeachment indicated that most of Peruvians wanted Vizcarra to end his term in office, and investigations by the Attorney General's office to continue while he's in office. And then once he's finished, they could, of course, go on. It was perfectly legitimate to have both things run simultaneously. Investigations on the one hand and Vizcarra finishing his government. But Congress thought that it was an immorality to have a president with those corruption charges in charge of the government for the next 8 months. The reaction has been, as I said, against this parliamentary coup. The people believe that it's absolutely arbitrary. There was no need to add a political crisis to a sanitary and economic crisis in the middle of this tragedy. We've been heavily affected by the pandemic, and it was not necessary to sack Vizcarra. And the polls indicated that. But of course, Congress thought otherwise, and we are paying the consequences. The reaction of the international community has been very slow and extremely cold. And the Secretary General of the OAS has asked the Constitutional Tribunal of Peru to decide whether the vacancy or the fast-track impeachment was carried out according to the Peruvian Constitution. That's very interesting because the international community is waiting to see whether the Merino government is a legitimate government or not. And the reaction of the markets haven't been good. I'm sure Luis will comment on that. The Merino government, what has Merino done? He has appointed a new cabinet. Yesterday, the cabinet, started work, so to speak. He has appointed a rather conservative, right-wing cabinet, integrated by rather old people, experimented, but old people, out of touch, I would say, and representing the order Vizcarra attempted to replace by the dissolution of Congress in September of 1919. So this is a sort of revenge for the dissolution of Congress over a year ago. And of course, this is very much out of touch with Peruvian people that applauded enthusiastically to the dissolution of Congress over a year ago. And this explains the reaction. Vizcarra was extremely popular. People ask me why the reaction was not the same when Kuczynski, 2 years and a half ago, he had to resign, but he was forced to resign under the threat of this fast-track impeachment. And of course, PPK was not as popular as Vizcarra. On the contrary. So, what's in danger as a result of the coup? Elections are in danger. Elections should take place in April. They are in danger. Merino has said that they are not, but everybody believes that they are. University reform is in danger. The new prime minister has been a lawyer of those universities affected by the university reform. Anti-corruption investigations are in danger. And the balance of power is in danger. The balance of power has been broken. Now we have Congress controlling the executive, and in a couple of months, the Congress should elect the new constitutional tribunal, which is a balancing force to the executive and the legislative power. So that's also in danger. What next? Two reflections. First, protests. They will carry on for a while. I don't think they will dwindle and disappear as the government believes. They will go on. Difficult to imagine that they will escalate, because the protest last night was probably the largest in the last 20 years, resembling, of course, those that took place in the last days of Fujimori. Secondly, I think Merino has started very badly. When he needed to inspire confidence, his appointments have contributed to confirm the war's menaces, the war's fears of those that are against the parliamentary coup. The Constitutional Tribunal has a request by Vizcarra's government in the previous vacancy process, and it should say a word. They could say that they were asked to give an opinion on the previous impeachment process, not on this one. There are others that say it should give an opinion as to whether this last impeachment was constitutional or not. So there are great questions as to what the Constitutional Tribunal will do. Secondly, there's a question of what Congress could do. Congress could say that a few congressmen are saying that they voted under ¿cómo se dice? Amenazas, no? And threats of losing prerogatives in Congress if they didn't vote in favor of them. So that could be a reason to vote again and censure Merino, who is president because he's president of Congress. So if he's censored as president of Congress, he could have to be replaced by somebody else. And that's an alternative as well. And they could run together with whatever the Constitutional Tribunal does. If the Constitutional Tribunal avoids to give an opinion on this, I think that the scenario will be greatly complicated in the near future. Let's hope that the Constitutional Tribunal, but it's a matter of votes. The dissolution of Congress was legalized by 4 votes against 3. And will those 4 votes against be useful to invalidate this last impeachment? That's a big question. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Gino. That was terrific. Really, really helpful. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of those excellent points. Let me turn it over now to Cynthia.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, and thanks for the invitation. And it's great to be here with Luis, and it's great to see Gino again, and really appreciate your comments, Gino. And I'm going to be echoing quite a bit of what you said, and also what Mike introduced our session with. First, we have to remember that this crisis the political crisis is so severe because it's on top of the pandemic and the economic catastrophe. So, as Mike said, this pandemic has taken a toll in terms of the fatality rate per capita in Peru is the worst in Latin America, the third worst in the world, about 30% higher death toll than in the other set of countries behind Peru, such as Brazil, Mexico, Chile. To put this in comparison, and Mike was raising, I think totally aptly, the comparison with the Sendero Luminoso years and the horrors of that era. The death toll in Peru now is 35,000. That's in the course of some 9 months. The death toll, that's about half the death toll of the some 15 years of Sendero. So this has been a horrific, horrific toll of the pandemic. And obviously that makes everybody more frustrated, more angry, more intense, and makes this political crisis worse. And then, as Mike said, the economic plummet on the order of 14%, the worst in Latin America, save Venezuela. So we can see why everyone is on edge, why the knives are out, and it's very, very tragic. So why is this political crisis so severe? I agree a lot with Gino. First, it's unprecedented in Latin America for an impeachment of a president that was so popular, and where something like 75% of Peruvians have been polled in opposition to the impeachment. This is unprecedented. Vizcarra's 50% or more approval rating, it might not sound that high, but by Peru's standards, more than 50% at this juncture of a term is, I think Gino used the word, in the stratosphere. This is just incredible. So the concept of impeaching such a popular president. Of course, there have been other coups in Latin America or impeachments that were polarizing. And I think the key comparison that comes to mind is Honduras in 2009, where the president is ousted and there is huge backlash. There was similar polarization around the impeachment of Rousseff in Brazil, the impeachment of Lugo in Paraguay. Those presidents had sectors of support, but it tended to be on the left, not so much the middle classes. In this case, this is a cross-class opposition. It's pretty much, again, more than 75%. It's not a left-right conflict. I think it's perceived as a conflict almost for the soul of Peru, existential. This is the fight against corruption, the fight of an effort to be truly democratic, truly transparent, truly accountable against this corrupt traditional political class. Now that's, I think, is sort of an exaggeration, but I think it's also the perception, as Gino was getting at. That's why, so many have gone to protest. So again, this unprecedented nature for Latin America, for Peru, of such a popular president being impeached. Second reason why the crisis is so severe, as Gino highlighted, it's not just that the champion of the anti-corruption effort has been impeached, it's also that the opposition is taking over. So traditionally, when there's an impeachment, what happens is the vice president assumes power, right? But in the case of Peru, Vizcarra was already the vice president, taking over from PPK. The second vice president had resigned. And so what happens is the Speaker of the Congress assumes power. So in this case, Manuel Merino. And as Gino mentioned, Merino was very much a part of this traditional political class. He's been in Congress a long time, provincial legislator. Flores Arauz, the newly named prime minister, he too, as Gino said, veteran, very, I'm not around to criticize older people, but Gino said this is the older political class coming back in. So one, a popular president is impeached. The opposition to that president is now in power. Again, this was what made the polarization in Honduras, Brazil, Paraguay severe also, no? That also in those countries for diverse reasons, again, with the vice president left for one reason or another, or vice president, another party, whatever. But obviously it's going to be much, much more polarizing when an opposition figure takes power. It's also the case that this is different from most impeachments, different from all the impeachments that I've mentioned, except the Honduras impeachment, and that it's so close to an election. So this concern that Gino mentioned too, that abuse of power. The Merino hails from Acción Popular. That was the #1 vote getter, the majority, well, the plurality party in Peru's Congress. So this fear of a concentration of power in these traditional parties, when Acción Popular is also hoping to win the presidency just a couple months away. So tremendous fear, as Gino said, about reversal of the university reform, other reforms. But also, how can they tilt the playing field in their favor? And Peru had an example of this in 2016 with Guzman from the Partido Morado, who was disqualified on very vague grounds. So there's a big concern about the possibilities to pack the Electoral Commission, pack the Constitutional Tribunal, other favors that could distort the election. Now, I'm going to highlight a fourth reason why I think the crisis is severe, but first I'll mention that I'm not entirely in agreement with Gino about the incapacidad moral clause. I believe that PPK was impeached. Fujimori was another. We all remember back in 2000, he's trying to resign, but the Congress decides to impeach him. And in these cases too, there was not really a meticulous trial. It was basically a sense that in the case of Fujimori, we saw that video of Montesinos accepting the bribes. It's enough. We've seen it, right? And with PPK, so I think the real difference was that they were unpopular. It's not that clause was ever clear, precise, and the trials were ever very good. It's that, in the judgment of Peruvians, Congress was misusing its power in this particular case. That doesn't mean I don't believe that clause is appropriate, right? But it's what had been used for quite some time. I also have to point out that Vizcarra gets these high marks when, on balance, you can't really say that the fruits of his efforts were yet that clear. I mean, the Constitutional Tribunal that we're talking about, there was supposed to be a new process for that begun a couple of years ago. It's still underway. The trials for PPK, none of these things are happening very quickly. That all the ex-presidents have been indicted, nothing much has happened. It's been a really tough slog, and Congress, the opposition forces are really strong. So the perception is that Vizcarra is trying very, very hard, but you can't really say that the fruits have been terrific so far. There's been a lot of resistance. It's not been easy. But the final fourth reason I'd highlight for why this crisis has been so severe is that there is kind of no white knight on the horizon in those April elections. The crop of candidates, I would say, so far is sort of on the unimpressive side, and the prospect that continued fragmentation of the political parties. Right now, the front runner in the polls is George Forsyth, who was came to acclaim as a soccer goalie. He has been the mayor of La Victoria, has been seen to be doing a good job, but he's very young, very, very unclear, how things would be going forward. Perhaps the candidate second in the polls is Daniel Oresti, who's kind of a populist. We've seen him around before. The prospects right now are not that great. So I think that if there were some sort of white knight on the horizon, we probably, if taking us back to the 1980s, of course, this proved to be incorrect, but kind of in the woes of the Belaunde administration, 1983, 84, Alan Garcia was already on the horizon as this white knight who was going to save Peru. And of course, that didn't happen, but it was the perception. So that's problematic too. What I fear and what Gino fears is a kind of Honduras crisis, prolonged, enduring, marks the country for years, cannot overcome it. Obviously, we all hope that doesn't happen. What might be the salidas? I think Gino highlighted, if the Constitutional Tribunal could somehow come up next day or two with some kind of compromise, perhaps maybe you bring back, say, a Salvador del Solar, something like that. I don't know what the possibilities are, but some kind of salida that somehow satisfies different sides. I think Victor Andres Garcia Belaunde suggested Acción Popular retiring from the presidential race. That could help. If Merino does survive, somehow George Forsyth, somebody outdoing expectations, that would help. So I don't think we should start to weep yet, but I have been very, very worried. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Cynthia, for that very helpful perspective. Let's turn it over now to Luis. For the economics and how Peru is being viewed by the investor community.
Thanks, Michael, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I think, well, investors, I would say that generally speaking, they take a very apolitical view. Investors don't take sides. They just make sure that whoever is in power does the right thing. And that is, obviously a huge question mark right now. So, trying to explain exactly, whether this was legal or illegal, for those that have money invested in the country, it is almost like a second order thing. There's always like this forward looking, what comes next question that is plaguing market participants right now. So let me take stock, to complement the comments from my co-panelists more on the economic side. So it was already mentioned, Peru had the worst growth performance among the larger Latin American countries. Our own projection is 13.5% decline. And we have a forecast of growth of 8.5% next year. That looks very good on paper, but when you have such a double-digit decline, it's not difficult. There's a statistical effect almost of rebounding so much. So, the headline would be a nice one, but we don't know whether. It's not going to make much of a difference probably in terms of, generation of income and employment, etc. And specifically because COVID is not over, and even though we're getting some good news about the availability of a vaccine, I think that by the time that it gets to Peru and it gets distributed broadly, it's going to take some more time. So I think that the situation from that perspective is also going to remain vulnerable still next year. What are the things that are what are investors focusing on? So, well, we already know who the new finance minister is. Mr. Jose Arista. I think that a lot of people know him. They remember him from previous stints as vice minister. He was in the director for the budget. He was cultural minister, etc. So he has had some interaction with investors, and I have known him myself. In many of his various reincarnations in the public sector along the years. So at least it's good. And I think that I would say that was seen as a positive from the market perspective, that someone that had been already in the public sector, in the finance ministry, was taking over because, he could at least, hopefully hit the ground running, given the tasks ahead. So what are the things that we need to watch? The most immediate thing, there's the approval of the budget for 2021 that needs to happen by the end of this month. So we have a bit over two weeks to go. And the budget was forecasting in the draft that was presented has a forecast of reducing the budget deficit from 12% of GDP almost this year to 6.2% next year. My guess is that an interim administration, in these very difficult political circumstances with COVID is still raging, chances are that the deficit ends up being higher, not lower. So, remains to be seen what happens there. The good news, however, is that we have at least I think the overall environment in which all this is happening in Peru, external in the market, because of the market, moving on past the U.S. elections, and with cheering up about the prospect of availability of a vaccine, at least in the developed countries next year, and of course expectations that central banks, the Fed, and others are going to keep interest rates very low, at least has the prospect of making Peru, quote unquote, attractive in terms of generating capital flows, just because of the yield differential vis-a-vis US treasuries. But foreign investors are already quite invested in Peru. 55% of the stock of local currency bonds, the Peru Soberano bonds, are already in foreign hands. So maintaining confidence in the investor community is key. And I hope that the initial signals coming out of Peperista are the right ones from that perspective. Second, there's still the issue of both the private pension funds and the public pension system. What comes next? As we know, there's a second round of private pension withdrawals that was approved, that has to be implemented. There was a proposal to allow withdrawals from the public system, the ONP, which is an aberration, because this is not an individual capitalization account system. It is a pay-as-you-go system. So whatever money is there is actually to pay current pensions. So to return contributions is you're basically taking money away from those that are going to be receiving it currently. This is certainly not budgeted. The Vizcarra administration was going to challenge it in the Constitutional Tribunal as being anti-constitutional, just because it was creating a liability for the government that there was no coverage for. But now that the tables have turned around, we don't know exactly what is going to be the posture of the new administration regarding the ONP contribution. So something to watch. The size of the withdrawals that were being discussed equates to 2% of GDP. That would be additional deficit if all of a sudden it gets approved and the government needs to start returning that money or paying that money out. And that's not in the calculation that I just gave you, or the target of 6% of GDP deficit for next year. So something to watch there. And then, of course, there is the issue of having to finance a larger deficit at a time when the public debt is already in upward trajectory. So in Peru, there was this fiscal responsibility law that put a cap on public debt of 30%, and up until recently it was actually respected. But because of COVID, the Vizcarra administration saw fit to get a temporary exemption to the rule, just because it was impossible to keep debt at that level. So last year, 2019, we stayed below 30% of GDP. The projection is that very fast in the next couple of years, Peru's debt to GDP is going to go to close to 40%, and our projection, short of a big fiscal tightening the years ahead, is that it's probably going to converge to 45%. Now, that number itself is not, in the emerging market context, is not a bad number. So, fortunately, Peru enter into all this crisis with a still, rather strong fiscal and debt, balance sheet from compared to other emerging market countries. Just to give you a sense, before COVID, the average for emerging market public debt was a little bit above 50%. It's going to go up to 62, 63% next year. And Peru may converge in the coming years to maybe 45%. So this is still going to be below the EM average, but you may still see pressure on the credit ratings of Peru. So Peru is still rated quite highly, BBB+. There's already been some downgrades from at least one rating agency, but we should not be surprised if we see more negative outlooks or maybe some downgrades. At least, though, I do think that given that Peru's debt to GDP would still be below the EM average, that we may still see Peru staying in investment grade in the BBB range and not lose it, which is a risk in other countries, Colombia or Mexico, in the years ahead. That is something to watch. One last thing is that because of COVID, Peru has basically used up a lot of these cushions that it had in the public sector. Some treasury accounts at the central bank. So all these cushions, because they're being used up, it means that going forward, whatever the next government does is going to be a lot more important in driving confidence and certainly in generating positive or negative outcomes. Peru, we have had this dichotomy for a long time in which the economy was roaring ahead and was growing at a high pace, regardless of what was happening on the political side. And that was because there were quite a bit of cushions, FX reserves as a central bank are there, they're still there. And you had, of course, cushions of savings in the public sector. Now that the savings are being depleted because of COVID, you're going to have a situation of much more vulnerability to whatever the next government does. So this divergence or dichotomy between economics and politics in Peru is not going to probably play out the same way it had played out over the past 15 years. And so whatever the next government does, obviously it matters. One last point to bring up, this is also another fortunate thing for Peru, is that it does have this foreign credit, flexible credit line with the IMF of $11 billion that literally was approved a month or so ago. It does allow Peru, it's $11 billion that Peru can use for fiscal purposes. So there was a bit of a change of mindset from the IMF of allowing this money to be used fiscally. Colombia has already tapped it for that purpose, and Peru, may well decide to do so. So at least, we're not predicting a crisis, and I don't think that the market is reacting that way. We have seen pressure on the currency. We have seen pressure on rates, rather contained. I think that in the next 8 months, there's always the danger, obviously, of additional dollarization of domestic portfolios. I mean, I do get, when I start to get calls from aunts and uncles, should I buy dollars? You start to feel like, okay, maybe that's a reflection of the domestic mindset. People are feeling anxious because of what they're seeing on the political front, and they want to protect their domestic portfolio. So and now that there's so much liquidity injected in soles by the central bank, a lot of this liquidity could end up going to the FX market. So that is something to watch, whether Peruvians lose confidence once again in the local currency and start to switch to dollars in the months ahead. So let me stop there, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Luisa. Really, really helpful. And I think especially this relationship between the politics and the economics in Peru has always been a sort of a puzzle, because they've had a lot of political turmoil and instability, and yet as you said, the last 15 years things have been going well, and this may be a inflection point, or at least a possibility can go in a different direction. So I really appreciate that perspective. We have a lot of questions and not a lot of time, so I'm going to try to cover them as much as I can. I had a few questions, but some of the questions that some of our participants have are similar to mine. And the first question, maybe for Gino, and also if Cynthia wants to weigh in, has to do with the armed forces. And the sense was, when the Congress was disbanded when Vizcarra disbanded the Congress, the armed forces seemed to be with him. They don't seem to have a great confidence in Merino. And just your sense of what role do you expect the armed forces to play in this scenario? And are they just on the sidelines? Are they waiting for the court to weigh in? And somebody else asked, related to that, is there a chance that they'll actually be sympathetic and join and support the protests, seeing that this is where the overwhelming majority of Peruvians are out on the streets? How do you see that? Let me start with Gino, and if Cynthia wants to add anything, it'd be great.
Let's hope the armed forces keep neutral, not getting involved in what's going on. Public order is in charge of the national police. It should be kept under the national police. And I hope they won't involve themselves. I don't believe they are willing to. They were loyal to Vizcarra because Vizcarra was president then. They should be loyal to Merino. I believe so, until that constitutional tribunal gives a verdict on this issue. If it doesn't, I believe that's my impression and that's my wish as well. Okay. They will keep neutral. They haven't shown or given any indication that they want to play a larger role. They want to get involved in politics. They know their involvement will not be popular unless, of course, they might side with the streets vis-a-vis Merino, but I can't see them playing that role because public order, again, is in the hands of the national police. And the national police is under the government, and the government is under Merino these days. Even if it's an illegitimate government, but it's the national government, and it's there where the police should be. And let me only say a word: the police is being extremely violent in response to peaceful protests, unusually so, and that's very bad. That adds to the unpopularity of Merino.
Thanks. We should just let our participants know that Gino was the Minister of the Interior in Peru, so he knows everything there is to know about the Peruvian police. Cynthia, you want to add anything? You've studied law.
I agree with Gino. I would just add that it's very distressing to kind of see that this question does come up. It comes up rightly. The images after the decision that there was a vote of no confidence in October, and those images of Vizcarra with top military commanders by his side. Now, that was troubling. The fact that that raising this question of a military role. But I agree with Gino. Ultimately, they will want to stay neutral at this point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gino, another one for you, if we could. You had mentioned Willow Fortunoff mentions that you said that the international response has been cold. And maybe you can clarify or elaborate what kind of support were you hoping for? I think most Latin American governments, if not mistaken, have recognized Merino. Is that what you're referring to, that was a mistake? In other words, what would you hope would happen?
The impression we have is that the recognition by the Latin American community has been, as I said, extremely cold, extremely formal. There's even no reference to Merino himself in the communiques that have been made public. There's an indication that they hope that the process is carried on under the constitution, and that they expect, in the case of Colombia, they expect, like the OAS has suggested, that the constitutional court decides whether this vacancy or impeachment process was carried on under the Peruvian constitution. So our feeling here in Peru is that Merino hasn't received the backing of the Latin American community, and less so of the international community. And that's one of his great weaknesses. So that's what I would have to say. I hope that Constitutional Tribunal decides to keep quiet or backs the decision by Congress. This is a weak government, lacks legitimacy. The decision has been arbitrary. There was no need, to create this crisis so close to the elections, and that's why we are having the problems we are having right now. Let me only add to what Cynthia said. I haven't meant to say that I foresee a protracted political crisis. I think the Constitutional Tribunal could sort it out. It's not going to be easy. If it doesn't, we fortunately have elections in 5 months. So, the crisis could carry on until April, but we have the elections, which is a mechanism to sort out this crisis. So what we have to preserve is the deadline for the elections for April, to ensure that Merino doesn't use power to favor one candidate against another. He doesn't use public resources to favor one candidate against the other, and that he's responsible, because there's the fear that since this is an unpopular government, it would use scarce public resources to, pump up its popularity. This is a clear threat. And the other one is that it would use those public resources to favor some candidates against another. So we have to be vigilant there. First, to ensure that elections take place, and second, to avoid Merino playing a role in those elections. If that's the case, even if there's no constitutional court opinion or decision on this matter, in 5 months' time, the crisis should be, I'm not saying over, but we could sort it out. Then we would have a fragmented parliament, of course. The country will go on being polarized, but I'm hopeful that the next elections would allow us to get out of this mess to a great extent.
Great, thank you. Although as Luis reminded us that a lot can happen in the next 5 months. It's not a lot of time, and I think that's, you outlined the best scenario, but there's also a lot of things that can be done in that period before the elections. There's a name that's come up in a number of questions that we've gotten, and maybe people are trying to, are very obviously worried watching the situation unfold, very worried and trying to think of a, sort of a transitional figure. And the name Valentin Paniagua is in a number of questions in here, who served after Fujimori and before, Toledo was president, and served in that sort of a caretaker transitional role. Is there a possible scenario for a Paniagua kind of figure playing a role later? Does one exist? Can you imagine a scenario where a Paniagua figure could emerge? Cynthia, you want to try that? And then
Sure. Well, that was the kind of scenario I was hoping for when I mentioned the name of Salvador del Solar. I was trying to think of the kind of person who might be able to fill that role. And I was thinking a little bit because, again, in the context of Fujimori, obviously, so the whole party, the whole team was pretty much discredited. And so the need for a very neutral figure like Paniagua, and I think the only president of Peru in the last 30 years that has not been indicted. But in this particular case where Vizcarra has such popularity, again, someone like Salvador del Solar, who was closer to Vizcarra, could be positive. But I think Gino might be a little bit closer to it to identify some person like that from the Congress, but it's such an era of confrontation, no? And it's sort of something that, in a way, the knives have been out now for quite a few months. And so finding someone who has that kind of support from both the traditional political class and the Vizcarra team, it would be difficult. One thing I'd add to Gino's comments about the international community, I think it's a very sad sort of moment for the international community, that between the problems in the United States and so many domestic problems in so many countries, there just has not been that effort to get engaged, get involved, and try to help in crises like this. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things, going back to Gino for a second, if you can comment on the Paniagua thing, but also Human Rights Watch, as I'm sure you've seen, called yesterday for calling an emergency meeting of the Permanent Council of the OAS and invoking the Democratic Charter and looking at that. Just want to get your opinion about that suggestion, as well as anything else about what Cynthia just mentioned, Gino.
I think every effort made in the context of the OAS and the Latin American international community will help to avoid Merino taking steps that threaten the elections, that threaten key issues today that do not help to quiet down the situation. Like university reform, the election of the Constitutional Tribunal, etc. But to do exactly what purport to do, the pressure has to add to national peaceful demonstrations to avoid those scenarios. Eventually, it was the case. With the help of the Constitutional Tribunal or without it, there's a chance that Congress revises its decision. It's easier that it would revise it with the support of the Constitutional Tribunal. But demonstrations are forcing parties to rethink what they have done. There's no Paniagua here, and the situation is very different from what it was in the last days of Fujimori. But, and one has to remember that Paniagua was a congressman. Salvador de Solar is not a congressman. So the idea is that if Congress revises its decision, it might choose somebody else more in line with the feeling in the streets, so to speak, to carry on for the last eight months, to be a credible caretaker government to ensure that elections will take place without interference and in the quiet of scenarios. And in that case, it would have to be a congressman among those that didn't vote for the vacancy. And it would have to be one from the ranks of the parliamentary group that holds, that has the largest majority in Congress, which is Acción Popular, the party of Merino. And some names have been given. Roel, for example, Luis Roel could be, he's very young, but he would be more easily acceptable because he rejected the vacancy, and he could eventually carry on for the next 8 months. That's a scenario, a possible scenario in the future if Merino doesn't hold on to power.
Great, thank you. Let me go back to Luis, because we have a number of questions directed at him. One is from Desiree Green, asking, beyond the pension withdrawal approvals that have been approved, what other measures or steps are expected on pensions and pension reform this year?
Well, in general, a pension reform tends to have such a, you do a reform, and the impact of a reform like that takes, years or decades to come to fruition, to see the results, to see the impact. You would almost not wish that such an important reform gets debated in an interim government that is going to be, out of power, hopefully in 8 months, right? If hopefully there's no delays to the election calendar. So, but at the same time, so ideally you would say, please leave things as they are. This should be the task of the next administration. Unfortunately, in the Congress, there's these initiatives, of further withdrawals from the private pension system, the AFPs, and there's now this initiative of returning contributions to the ONP, the Public Pension Fund. And in the context of having to keep returning money or it is probably better to do it as part of a pension reform. So I don't know if this interim administration of Mr. Merino is going to, say anything about that or try to tackle it. There's obviously political pressure now that the genie is out of the bottle. The idea of making this returning these contributions is out. Maybe it's not going to be possible to bring it in, and maybe Minister Arista is going to need to come up with some creative way of giving some token amount of money to people on account of the NP. I don't know exactly what comes next. That's a key thing to watch, I would say. But I clearly a pension reform is needed. But to do it seriously, to have political representation, in my opinion, this is something that should be left to the next administration after July 28th, 2021, and not done in a haste amid all these political pressures, amid all this fragmentation, and all this very charged environment right now.
Great, thank you. Luis, if I could just follow up with one other we have from Jose Gonzalez. who asked about if you have any comments about foreign investment, especially in the mining sector, in light of the very turbulent domestic dynamics today in Peru.
Mm-hmm. Well, this type of investment, like in mining or certainly in extractive sectors, you would think that they tend to be very long dated. So again, it's multi-years of investment and multi-years of extraction, etc. So companies that invest in this type of sectors, I think that are used to make decisions under quite uncertain circumstances, and oftentimes the expected returns adjusted for these uncertainties, still is a positive return, which means that they can proceed with it. So I don't think that what has happened is not necessarily going to lead to a full dry up of foreign investment. Certainly things that were already planned may continue as planned. Again, we're not talking about a political, where there's a political crisis, but we're not talking about an economic crisis here. The situation, I think that thankfully initial conditions in Peru were strong, and Peru is using up its buffers, but the buffers are still there, and that is why we're not seeing a blow up economic situation. I think that investments that haven't yet been fully signed off on, and this applies foreign investors plus local investors, you have to imagine that everyone is going to wait to see what happens in the next election, right? Why would you not take the option to wait if 8 months from now you're going to have a different government? You don't need to wait 8 months. You can wait until April or May when we have the second round to know who's coming to make your decision. So I think that in our own projections for growth, I told you already we have 8.5% for next year. We were debating do we need to bring it up or down, and certainly I think that from the private investment point of view, maybe there's going to be downward pressure on that forecast, but there may be more upward pressure coming from fiscal policy, because as I mentioned before, there's going to be very little incentive, to be fair and honest, or maybe not even incentive, impossibility of this interim government to rein in fiscal deficit. The pressure for spending are going to be there. We see it. We see it in the Congress. All these initiatives, they all carry fiscal cost. So trying to stop them may be very difficult. So and fiscal policy is growth supportive, at least in the short term. So we may see, in a way, the government taking, still an important role versus the private sector. So private investment decisions, those that haven't been taken yet, that are not in a multi-year phase of investments, may be held off until next year.
Great, thank you. I have a question for Gino, and related to really the protests and the situation on the ground in Peru. One question is by Gideon Long of the Financial Times, who asks, "You think the protests will continue and grow? Are they confined to Lima, or have they spread to other towns and cities?" And related to that, Gino, if I could ask, a lot of us were analyzing the protests in many Latin American countries, in Chile, in Ecuador, and Colombia a year ago, which included a lot of issues and a sort of demand for greater equality and greater justice, social justice. Do you think that this could, do you imagine a scenario where this could, this protest that you've been part of against the vacancia of Vizcarra could ignite broader protests in Peru around other issues, and just in terms of the poverty and inequality and the economic system and the like? Do you see that this could trigger something a little bit more widespread?
Protests are not only circumscribed to Lima, they are nationwide, and they are pacific, peaceful. Although government figures have said that the shining path is behind them, and they are spontaneous. So there's a danger that they will dwindle, which is what the authorities and Merino expect. But it appears to be pretty unlikely at this stage. Why is the people in the streets? It's very unclear. Since these are spontaneous protests, they express rage and disagreement with what Congress has made, but there's no clear, political program behind this. Could this change into that? Well, political actors will attempt to take advantage of the situation in electoral terms, and the left, of course, part of the left would like this to transform itself into the previous stages of Asamblea Constituyente, a constitutional assembly. But it's only small groups favoring this sort of outcomes. I think that the greatest effort by political actors will be to take advantage of this in terms of electoral terms. And commenting Cynthia, Ipsos Peru has said that there are not going to be greater surprises. At this stage, there are 5 or 6 front runners, and the next president should be among them. And you have Forsyth and Guzman in the center, Verónica Mendoza in the left, and then Keiko Fujimori, Urresti, a former army general, and Acuña. I think these last 3 will be affected by the decision of Congress because they were part of it. I think that Forsyth, Guzman, that voted against, and Mendoza, that is not present in Congress, are going to favor of this, are going to take advantage of this situation.
Thank you. Let me turn, we're going a few minutes over, but we're going to conclude. There are just so many great questions. I don't want to abuse people's time, but let me go to Cynthia, if I could, real quick. Our friend Steve McFarland, who knows Peru well and served there when I lived there in the late 1980s, asked whether you think the new government, what the new government will try to do regarding the corruption prosecutions.
Well, that's a great question. Thanks. Thanks, Steve. I think, unfortunately, as we have highlighted, the new government does come very much from a political class that is accustomed to, let's say, accommodating corruption. I think Vizcarra has charged that more than half of the Congresistas have allegations, at least, against them. So this would not be off to a good start. There are major concerns about compromises due to profits from universities. Now, this affects Acuña, who Gino mentioned. It affects Flores Arauz, apparently. So it's very worrisome. It's very worrisome. And I would agree with Gino in terms of his response to Mike's last question. This has not been to date, and it doesn't look like it's going to be a call for greater equality or justice. The real focus of the protests has been on the corruption problem, and it's very multi-class, very, very multi-class. Now, when you look at the protesters, these are people from every sector of Peruvian society. So as I said, the irony is that the effort against corruption wasn't bearing a lot of fruit already. There was so much resistance. These wheels of justice in Peru, if they turn slowly in the United States and elsewhere, so a lot of resistance. And how to make that happen. Vizcarra's approach was confrontation, and that there probably wasn't another way, but let's hope for improvement. That's what Peruvian people want. That's what I want. That's what everybody here wants. And so we've got to hope. And I love Gino's suggestion of an Acción Popular congressman who had voted against the vacancia to assume the presidency. So that'd be a terrific compromise.
Great, thank you. We're really at the end of our time, but I want to, if I could, just ask one final question to Gino specifically. And that has to do with Vizcarra. He is clearly the most popular politician in Peru. He has a large percentage of support despite the situation that you described in terms of the pandemic and the economy, which itself is a bit of a puzzle, because usually they would pay a political cost, but Vizcarra seems to be enjoy broad support. What happens? What do you see as his role now? Is it possible that he will change his mind and be a candidate in April, even though he says that he won't, and the Constitution says that he can't? Will he be a kingmaker? Will he use his political popularity and support to back one of the other candidates that you just that you just mentioned? In other words, what happens to him now? How does he use his political capital that he still has and far exceeds anybody else in the country at this point?
Well, one, he could be reinstated in the presidency if the Constitutional Tribunal decides that impeachment was null and void. So that's one. Mm-hmm. Two is that he in any case, he'll have to deal with the investigations against him that are carried out by an independent body, which is the Attorney General's office and the judiciary. And it'll be a great challenge to see that this independence is respected. And that's a challenge for the new Congress as well, because Congress could interfere with that independence in attempting to sack those judges and attorney generals that are the heads of those independent bodies. So they are independent, but Congress can interfere with those. There's a great challenge. But what I'm trying to say is that currently he might be reinstated. If he's not, there's some talk that he could be a candidate to Congress, to next Congress. In whatever scenario, he has investigations against him that are very compromising, which is, again, another paradox. How come Vizcarra, heading the country in the middle of this tragedy with awful results in the health system and in the economic system, be so popular? And at the same time, how can he be so popular heading the anti-corruption effort while at the same time having these allegations of corruption against him? I think he has benefited from the short span of the impeachment process that hasn't allowed, the public to take stock of the serious allegations that he's facing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gino. Really, this has been a superb, stimulating session. I learned so much, and I want to thank our excellent panelists for agreeing to join on short notice and sharing their insights and expertise. Gino, Cynthia, and Luis, really, thank you so much. It was really great to get your perspective and very, very helpful. I want to thank all the participants who tuned in and submitted great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but there's just too many and our time was limited, and which just shows that we'll have to have another event as the situation, uncertain situation unfolds, that all of us are watching with great concern. I want to finally just thank Gaston Ocampo for organizing this event and all of his support. And I want to just wish everybody well, and I hope you'll stay safe and healthy and take good care in this very, very difficult circumstances that all of us are dealing with today. So thanks again for everything, and we'll be having more events as on Peru and other key issues in the hemisphere. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gracias,